Great. So, yeah, there's so much to talk about, and I know I sent you a bit of a summary of the kind of things I wanna get to.
Yep.
But I think we're gonna have to be quite decisive on what we touch on to be able to use our time productively.
Okay.
But let's see how we go.
Okay. Why don't you? I'm recording this. I assume that's okay.
Okay.
And
Yes, I think let's decide afterwards if it's usable or not.
Perfect. Perfect. So why don't you first introduce yourself a little bit? And now you and I have never spoken before in person, so you sent me a little bit of background information about yourself, but tell me a little bit about yourself.
All right. So I'm from South Africa, Johannesburg. I'm a filmmaker, actually. I'm a director. I mostly do, TV commercials, short films, documentaries, and feature films coming up. Just to give you a bit of background, I would place myself as like a reformed Calvinist with a kind of a touch of Petersonianism, and a bit of an evangelical in a way as well. And I'm a massive Tim Keller fan.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yes. No. He really reformatted my theology a few years back. But I am an Afrikaner. I'm not sure if you know the Afrikaans culture in South Africa, if you know anything about it.
A little bit. I know some of its relation is with the Dutch and
so there's a Dutch descent. We have a bit of French Huguenot in us and so on. But the Afrikaners, people like me, we were behind apartheid.
Right.
So we created the forced segregation, and that was actually conceived by the Dutch Reformed Church, scarily enough.
Mm-hmm.
Something which was really a very utopian project, which we'll get to a bit later on. But they were essentially Puritans, and had a bit of a twisted, I think, interpretation of Calvinism, possibly. But many of us Afrikaans people, were against apartheid. That really became a totalitarian utopia, that really went horribly wrong. And my grandfather was a writer who fought against it through his writing. And I'll speak to him a bit later. But so I grew up Presbyterian with my parents who left the Dutch Reformed Church in protest. But the way I want to start off with, I just want to give you a bit of a background of where this kind of drive in me comes from, with regards to utopianism.
Okay.
Is when I was 16, I was hit by a car on a highway. I walked across the highway and I was in a car accident, and took me about a year or two to recover. I pretty much broke all my bones except my neck and my back, but I somehow survived.
Wow.
But as a 16-year-old boy, it was. I kind of, in that time, obviously going through immense pain and suffering, I did see a bit of a dark side of myself, but also in the world around me. Kind of going into that really painful place, physically, emotionally, spiritually. But at the same time, while I saw this dark side, I also saw like the opposite, which is like a more, let's say the bright side, or a more hopeful side of life. It's amazing how when you look at the bright side of things, you actually get better quicker. In a sense, it helped me a lot. But the trauma that I went through essentially made me become very grateful and really interested in what constitutes real hope versus false hope. Because I really felt how hope, like in this painful time, pulled me through a lot, And the topic I want to unpack. And they, it really birthed my interest in like existential ideas and so on. And I especially wanted to explore the validity or the pitfalls of ideologies or religion, because this is essentially where hope is like being sold. Either it's real or it's a counterfeit.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I went on this journey to find out which religion and ideology seems the most valid. And Christianity really persuaded me very powerfully in my early 20s. and that influenced how I see the world, you know. But as I walked on this road of, you know, trying to figure out this Christian thing, which I'm still walking passionately today, you know, I saw some very good stuff, but also a lot of bad stuff, you know. In my environment, in my churches, and I got interested in kind of what hijacks this goodness, this hope, in a sense, and that kind of led me down a bit of a dark rabbit hole to kind of see what's behind all these things, you know. So just to getting to utopianism, because that's where I want to end up, is as a creative person, as a filmmaker, you know, as I kept making more films, I started to discover my voice more. And as you discover your voice, you kind of figure out what is it you want to say and why do you want to say it, you know. I've been developing this feature film of mine for the past 4 years, and you know, it's a story that I came across, that I found, that really grabbed me. It's a true story, but I never really found a personal connection to the story. It was, why am I doing this? Why am I telling this? And after a long period of time, after a lot of writing, I discovered that it essentially is dealing with this concept of utopianism. This idea of the heavens we build, or the heavens we try to build, that we are looking for to liberate us, can become our hells.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And this topic really fascinated me because it happened in my own country, as I mentioned to you earlier.
Right.
You know, apartheid.
Right.
And then, funny enough, 2 days after I found this theme, it was a big creative breakthrough in my film. There was a documentary on the radio about my grandfather, about 30 minutes long, and he actually spoke. You know, I heard him speak, and I was very young when he passed away. I was like 9, so I never really spoke to him, and I heard him speak. You know, and he spoke about what he writes about and why he writes, and he wrote many books. He wrote novels. He wrote philosophy, a whole mix of things, but he said it took him about 50 years to discover why he wants to write. And then he starts unpacking that, and he ended up on this idea of boundless idealism, the idea that we fall in love with, this utopia, and how it affects us in many ways. And I was so blown away, because now, okay, my grandfather now dealt with the same theme. And then I started reading his other books, and it was all over the place. And I was like, this seems to be quite interesting. Why is no one really talking about this? Maybe it's just me or whatever. And that happened, like, to me, that happened, you know, I would say 6 months ago for me. And since, you know, then I discovered Peterson after that, and that was extremely liberating, and it really strengthened my faith and my Christianity unbelievably, because it helped me dive deeper into my theology. And the deeper I dove, the more incredible it became, you know, especially the Old Testament, especially Genesis, the biblical lectures. I'm still reeling how much I enjoyed it, you know. So for me, I found it strengthened my faith. It strengthened my desire to know Christ, actually. So it's benefited me like that. But the reason I want to talk to you about utopianism is I wanted to maybe just to give you my definition of it first, and then based on that definition, I want to understand Christianity's relation to it, because Christianity itself does contain quite a bit of it. And you know, some people has even said that utopianism originates from Christianity, in a way, which is a total separate statement.
Yeah.
But I just want to give you a bit of a general idea, and then I want to just start hearing your thoughts. And I obviously have a lot of thoughts I have, but so basically, you know, to make it very simple, and let's call it kindergarten. You know, utopianism is a quest for heaven, really. And I think it's man's search for heaven, our deep, essential longing for what we will find there, right? Which is happiness, comfort, freedom, healing, restoration, redemption. All these wonderful things which we so deeply desire, obviously, is our quest for heaven, in my limited definition. But I also think utopianism itself has a shadow side, in a sense, and it's almost too easy to argue for the dark side of utopianism. Even intellectuals, anyone can get there, and see in the history. If you look at what happened in the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, apartheid, those were all utopias, right? And essentially, I can frame it as in the dark side. It's our rebellious independence statement from God. We're saying we are independent.
That's right.
We say we want control, we want power, we want pleasure. We want to survive. We want to deliver ourselves. We want to be in charge. It's our statement that we don't need something greater than ourselves.
Yes.
We don't need God. We don't need Him.
Right.
And I mean, that's just, and what's happening today, right? I've mentioned in the past now, if you look at the Gulag Archipelago, what happened there. But the polarization that's now taking place with the left and the right, which is becoming greater and greater and greater, and the vacuum in the middle is growing. The color, we obviously we have political utopianism, we have psychological utopianism, we have spiritual utopianism, but in a sense, the political trend is possibly, I think Peterson called it in his Quillette article, egalitarian utopianism, which is something that Soviet Union also dabbled with in a way, and maybe that's what we're seeing on the left now. But I think where I want to maybe land now before I continue and so on is utopia a misplaced vision of redemption? A misplaced vision of redemption. Is it? Does it masquerade as a compassionate, solution, but it's hiding its dark shadow? Is the heavens we try to build, do they not become our hell, and why? Is utopianism a good foe to fight for? I mentioned, I think Dostoevsky fought against it a lot. Niebuhr, I think, forgot his first name now. Then I also have, what's his name? Thomas Sowell wrote a book, The Conflict of Visions. He spoke about the constrained, the unconstrained vision. Yeah. I don't really know many others because, as I say, I'm not a philosopher. I'm a filmmaker. Yeah. I'm just interested in this because it informs my creative work. Yeah. And as a Christian, I'm trying to understand if I tackle utopianism as a Christian and I say, don't go there, then what does that say about Christianity? Is Christianity the antidote to utopianism? Yes. So, I mean, these are just my vomit. I just wanted to give you some context. So, okay. I don't know. I'm just like curious, and I want to know more, and I want to read more, and so on. Yeah. So,
well, I think your intuitions are very much on track. One of the takeaways that I've gotten from my year-long Peterson Odyssey is the realization that to the degree that we try to realize heaven on earth, to bring heaven down, we will also bring hell up.
Oh, wow.
And that's something that I've pondered often as I've continued to work through Peterson's ideas and his cautionary note. And then the question is why? So one of the things, another thing that Peterson has really brought me to lately is to think about what language is, why we use it, what words are. So we talk about God, and we've got ideas about what we mean by that word. We know that many of us mean different things by that word, but the word is an amazingly useful orienting device on a variety of axes. And I think so So often in Christianity, we use heaven, which is, as N.T. Wright keeps trying to clarify, is not the best, most precise term for the sum of our joys, let's say.
Wow.
Because more technically, if you read the New Testament talks in terms of the age to come, talks in terms in the Johannine segment of the New Testament. See, eternal life, if you read the Gospel of John and you compare it to the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we hear the kingdom of God. So there's what the Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So the Lord's Prayer, our Father who art in heaven. So heaven is a location. Hallowed be thy name. And the story of the Bible is the reconciliation of heaven and earth, basically. The end of the rebellion on earth and its reconciliation with heaven. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so right there in the Lord's Prayer, in the Sermon on the Mount, you have a tiny little outline of what the goal is. In the Gospel of John, most English translations have eternal life. And if you look, often people say, well, I'd like to know the Greek. Often the Greek isn't necessarily a huge improvement over English, let's say. But in this case, translators don't render, the Greek is basically life of the age. That's gets translated eternal life, because life of the age, that's kind of shortcut for life of the age to come, because the Bible tells time in ages. Now, what happens with Christianity is that in the resurrection,
which is the big deal. The new age begins, but it's overlapped with what's called the present evil age. I often call it the age of decay. Yes.
And so what happens with Christians is that they're living in both ages at once.
Yes.
And so when we talk, utopia comes out of, if I recall correctly, this comes out of an English novel, this word that we've used, and it's a word that we have adopted culturally in a sense for the sum of all joys, which might be another understanding, a specific aspect of our understanding when we say heaven. Oh, this is heaven on earth. When we say that, we're basically saying heaven is the sum of our joys. That's another way of saying it. Now, here's where Peterson is really helpful, because with all of his talk about hierarchies, which
hierarchies,
which we've attempted to banish, there are a hierarchy of values, and we can't, because the world is so complicated. We need, in his conversations with Sam Harris, he talks about this a priori structure. And what this a priori structure is that when I walk into my office, my attention is brought to something. Now, my office is a mess, and it is filled with clutter. But my mind has mapped all this clutter to the degree that even amidst the clutter, if I'm thinking about something I'm looking for, I know just where to look. My mind has mapped that. But there's a hierarchy of values that says there's some things that are more important. If a thief breaks into my office and steals something of value to me, if I walk into my office, I might notice right away that things have changed. Okay? So we can't help see without a hierarchy of values.
Yes.
Now, when we get to questions of utopia, the reason human beings are improper stewards of utopia is that we cannot escape this hierarchy of values.
And that's the original sin.
And that is, especially according to Larry Crabb. Larry Crabb is an evangelical psychologist who's written a great number of Christian books about Christian psychology, so on and so forth. He defines original sin as humanity defining that which is good. And I've read Larry Crabb years ago. And then I heard Peterson, and actually a pastor in Canada said, boy, Peterson reminds me a lot of Larry Crabb. And I had to think about that. And I began to recognize it's right here in this question of hierarchy. Because what Larry Crabb notes, what Peterson shows to be absolutely essential because of our limitations, is that we have hierarchies. So as soon as human beings become the definers, which is what humanism says. Humanism says, I just listened to the big conversation between Peter Singer and I forget the other guy's name. But, you know, Peter Singer basically says, well, there is no purpose in the universe. We know that. Well, I don't know how you know that, but there is no purpose in the universe. Therefore, it's up to us to define the hierarchies. It's up to us to define that which is at the top of the hierarchy. And via that, we then will define utopia. But once we do that, because we can't judge between, let's say, let's talk about racism. So the Afrikaner, to the degree that I knew it, my father was involved in the Christian Reformed Church because of, my father was involved in racial reconciliation in the Christian Reformed Church, but because of our Reformed familiar relationship with the Dutch South African churches, this then brought the Christian Reformed Church into that conversation.
Wow.
And so we had at least once a pastor from the Black South African church stay in our home. And because our congregation in Patterson was a mostly Black congregation, we talked about this growing up. And then when I was in college, there was a big movement at Calvin College to divest from, that was the divestment movement, to divest from South African entities and so on and so forth. So let's take, say, a Nazi approach. Racial purity or racial hierarchies are the top value in our hierarchy. Therefore, utopia will be constructed around race. Which obviously there was an element of that, and I don't know apartheid that well, but clearly there seems to be an element of that in the apartheid philosophy. There clearly was an element of that in the Nazi philosophy. And so
superior race.
Exactly. And so what you say then is that's at the top of your hierarchy. Therefore, all human utopias must, by virtue of our humanity and this a priori structure that Peterson talks about, all human visions of utopia have to reflect our assumptions of hierarchy. Now, here's our problem. Human beings cannot agree on that which is at the top of the hierarchy, apart from this tiny little word that theists call God. And this is a struggle with Peterson, because Peterson remains
city of God. He said the city of
God.
Well,
he says the city of God, but he has difficulty getting specific with that and reconciling that with his Darwinian epistemology, where he says all we can really know is that which survives. The difficulty with that, as I pointed out in a few of my videos more recently, is that which survives is only that which survives. It doesn't actually define that which is human or that which is Finchness or any of these things. So, and this is, I think, is the reason why I think you're right in your intuition that there's a deep connection between Christianity and utopian visions, because what Jesus, as he gives us a taste of the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God or the life of the ages or being in Christ. These are all New Testament words for this, the sum of all joys.
Yes.
Jesus gives us a taste of that. And that's in fact what many of his miracles are about. They're, water to wine. This is a taste of the life of the age. The healing of the lame and the sick and the blind and the raising of the dead. This is a taste. This is a sample of the life of the age.
The kingdom.
The kingdom, right. The difficulty that we have is when we begin to reduce the kingdom or the life of the age to come or heaven or one of these terms down into, when we start to get specific in it, that which is about, say, racial purity, or I think the contemporary one in the United States and in this culture is the abolition of suffering, or the egalitarian vision of happiness. No one has a right to be more happy than another. So if you have happiness privilege, we need to bring your happiness down so that other happinesses can come up. I mean, these tend to be sit at the top of our hierarchies. So then we naturally, once we place that at the top of our hierarchy, all of the other values come into line, and our actions will come into line with that, and we will automatically begin to try to construct these utopias unless we actually have a pretty robust theology that says we human beings ourselves cannot define the hierarchy. That
because of the sinful nature, right?
That's
because
right.
Of the,
because of our sinful nature, but also because of our limitations. Because I might look at this and say, you know, I think this value, a good value, should be at the top of the hierarchy. Now, this gets into the long conversation in the Old and New Testament of idolatry. When human beings take something and put it at the top of a hierarchy, we call it an idol. That's right. And Tim Keller is all over this.
Yes.
We call it an idol. Well, what is an idol? We take a good thing and we elevate it to an ultimate thing. That's simply another language. That's Tim Keller's language for Jordan Peterson's hierarchies. We place it at the top of the hierarchy. And whenever we do that, to the degree that we are successful in trying to create this utopia, we will likely be as successful in bringing up a hell. Because if you make this, say, this vision of racial superiority the top of your hierarchy, well, what hell do you bring up? Stands to reason. So I think you're asking all the right questions, and I think I can see very much how listening to Tim Keller and listening to Jordan Peterson, this all comes in. And this all goes back to Augustine, who basically looked at this and said, you know, it's about ordering our loves. Because when Augustine talks about ordering our loves, ordering, what do you mean by that? Well, putting them in a hierarchy, saying this love is more important than this. And so this is why, for example, Sophie's Choice, which, you know, you're a filmmaker, so you must have seen Sophie. Have you ever seen Sophie's Choice?
I did a while back. I can't really remember so much. But
well, Sophie's Choice is, of course, here this woman is asked by this Nazi guard to choose between her children, one to live and one to die. And of course, the drama is, how can you choose between your children? Your children are not identical. Your loves for them are not identical. But what's demanded of you is to create a hierarchy. And in a sense, people can't negotiate these hierarchies fully because we're only people. And so we're caught in reality where we're always having to create hierarchies, and often, okay, I have enough money to bring my child to the doctor or bring my dog to the doctor. I choose my child. That's fairly easy. But there are many questions that are not so easy. And God is that which properly establishes the hierarchy and judges us according to how well we conform to his vision of created order. Again, Larry Crabb, humanity falls when we decide the good. And so the expression, that makes sense. The expression of apartheid in South Africa was humanity deciding the good. And utopia is just the complete outcome of those decisions. Right.
So how can we use utopianism? If we say utopianism is a problem, how can we say Christianity is the better way? You know, because how can we make that link? I just want to make that link.
I don't think utopia. What is the, let's reframe the question. What is the problem with utopianism? One thing that is not a problem is our longing for the age to come. Our longing for all the world's sad truths to become undone. That is a good desire. That is a good love that we have. And so, like all such things, utopianism has a good that it is expressing.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
But and this is our particular weakness in our current cultural frame, without there being a God, when man becomes the measure, homo mensura, your humanity is the measure. When you, in a secular frame, when you take out the God, now suddenly both the blood and the glory are on our hands, and we are not up to the task. And so what happens, see, so what we've done, what secularism did was exchanged a couple of, made a choice. We said, because we can't agree on God, because our vision of God implicitly has within it a hierarchy that we're not really clear on, we're a little fuzzy on, because we don't want to fight about gods anymore. So we're going to take God out of the picture, and we're going to try to decide it amongst ourselves based on what? Based on empiricism or rationality. Yes. So, yes. But what we have done then is basically put ourselves in the chair of God, and tempted ourselves to imagine we are gods. Whereas yes. At least if you are bickering theists that can't agree on that which, on all the details of God, at least you might have the shared assumption that, okay, we might not be able to agree on the details, but there are a number of things we can agree on, such as I'm not going to kill you over our disagreement with respect to God.
Yes.
And that's something that happens in the West. And so people are worrying that Islam, are hoping that Islam reaches that point and has a reformation, so on and so forth. But so even if you have a God, you still have problems of, negotiating these hierarchies. But once you remove God, now suddenly it's all, once you remove God and you remove the afterlife, now you only live once. I need to have my best life now. And what's real about human relationships is that there are plenty of zero-sum games by which, if I'm going to have my best life now and you become an obstacle, what then is my ought? And this is where another one of Peterson's themes, this imago Dei, he doesn't use that often, but yes. the regarding another as an image bearer of God makes me stop and say, my yes. quest for my personal utopia cannot cross this line. I cannot kill my neighbor. I cannot violate the rights of my neighbor in my quest.
Now, on that point, on that quest, you might kill on your way to get there, right? Oh, so that means, so what I'm saying is that means sacrifice is a big part of this. And the reason I want to mention that is in Peterson's article about in his prelude to the Gulag Archipelago, in the book, he mentions something like this. He says, heaven is worth any price. There's simply no price too great to pay in pursuit of the ultimate utopia. It obviously costs something. That's right. Utopia does cost something, but who pays?
Right.
Do we pay ourselves like the Christians do, or do the others pay?
Well, this is where the sacrifice.
So the materialist utopians, they would say the others, which should be the perpetrator, the victimizer, the oppressor, or the member of the privileged group, they must pay.
That's
but
right.
Christianity solved the problem
right.
by insisting on the sacrifice of the self.
That's
Insisted that the suffering and the malevolence of the world is the responsibility of each individual.
That's right.
And so this is where Christ picked up the bill and sacrificed himself on behalf of us.
That's right.
And by doing so, he encourages us to do the same.
That's right.
Does that make sense?
That's exactly right. Because Christ, okay. on one hand, so then you have the problem that what I call the progressive liberationists have now is that, okay, so let's say, okay, Donald Trump is a racist.
Yeah.
Okay. What are you going to do with the racists? And right there you have the problem of human utopias. What are you going to do with the sinner?
Yes.
Because one of the things that we have found ourselves unable to do very effectively is change the heart of another. So
Yes.
what we grasp at is education. Well, what does that mean? Well, that's formation. All right. So we're going to re-educate you to, but here's the difficulty.
Yes.
We all know the limitations of education.
Yes.
And this gets then into Brave New World, the
Yes.
great Huxley novel.
Of course.
So we're going to educate. But what happens when we discover, well, Donald Trump's in his 70s. He's far beyond re-educating, okay? So what are you going to do with those who are resistant to your education?
Yes.
Well, now you've got camps. Now you've got, now you're going to imprison them for how long? Isn't the imprisonment is just going to make them more bitter? How pure do you need to be in your education? And so what happens is that Christ comes and pays for the sins of the world.
Yes.
All right. And this is why I always have, this is the Heidelberg Catechism, misery, deliverance, gratitude. Okay. And so now we ourselves ought to be little Christs. So the name of my church is Living Stones. And that's from 1 Peter, the living stone, and we are living stones. So we follow him. Well, why should we follow him? Well, we follow him, because the thing about Christ's sacrifice, and people sometimes pick this up in the comment section, is it's archetypal, as Peterson would say, in that was Jesus a victim? Yes. He's the sacrificial victim. Did Jesus do this voluntarily? Yes. And when you read the New Testament accounts of Jesus going to the crucifixion, he's arrested, he is taken by force, he is both betrayed by his own ethnic group and killed by those outside his ethnic group. So that takes the ethnicity off the table.
Yes.
He goes willingly, he sets his face to Jerusalem in the Gospel of Luke, and he's tied and bound and done this. So here, as Christians, obviously, a sacrifice, an animal that we sacrifice doesn't have a choice. We take the animal, and the animal does not want to be killed. We kill it. Jesus is both the victim and the willing sacrifice. And that's offer yourselves, what Paul says in Romans 12, offer yourselves as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God. This is your spiritual worship.
Yes.
So no, and it all comes right down to the heart of this Christian story, which is why C.S. Lewis looks at this and says, well, this is the missing chapter of all of humanity. And what's amazing about this story that Peterson can see, and why he keeps focusing on this, is there's so many different ways you come at it, and it keeps making sense.
Yes.
and this is why, so there's bickering going on in conservative reform circles about penal substitutionary atonement. Is this the exclusive view of atonement? I would argue no. I would say that our views of atonement, we definitely get from the Bible, and I would say penal substitutionary atonement is definitely biblical, but it's probably not the only way to see the truth of that atonement. Because the sacrifice of Christ answers every question, and therefore finally fulfills our desires for utopia while not making utopia our product.
There you go.
And I didn't want to say responsibility, because we do have responsibility, but we finally don't bring in the kingdom. And I think all of the language, let's say, of the book of Revelation, and the theology of the parousia, of the appearing of Jesus, of the coming of the kingdom, of the consummation, in the Bible, it's always clear that God does this work. But it's also clear that Christians ought to have their lives in alignment with that vision. And this is another thing that Peterson gets hung up on, and understandably so, because we can't work it out. We can't language it properly. Well, what is God's responsibility and what is our responsibility? Now, if you're a secularist and struggling with God, everything is going to be our responsibility. But that then leads you back into the temptation of utopianism. because we can't act, and this is Peterson's point, we can't act without there being an implicit hierarchy that we are acting out of. And so, in a sense, part of what Peterson is getting, part of what he's getting corralled into in terms of his political talking, which he just did via Twitter with this little Democratic ad that he put out, part of what happens is you keep getting corralled and forced to explicate your utopia. And so then you have to settle on something. And we all have to have a politics. So, but at least as a Christian, you will say, these are my ideas, but I am a master. I am a servant of my master. And so I am open to correction at any time.
Fantastic. That's a great attitude. Yeah.
So I don't know if that helps with your question.
No, it does. No, it does. Tell me, and would you, I mean, we can say then that Christ he is the ideal. He is the true ideal. He embodies the ideal.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. He is the incarnation. He is the logos, as the Gospel of John said.
But for the materialist, that will only make sense if they believe they can prove he rose from the dead. Because only then he could be the true ideal who then beat death. And,
especially in our present context where we still have the ghosts of positivism lingering, I am reluctant to too harshly pass judgment on those because of their cultural context who struggle with the physicality of the resurrection. I am hesitant to pass judgment on them because all of us have blind spots, theological blind spots that are inherent in our cultural matrix. And this question of materiality is obviously a huge cultural artifact for us that we struggle with. Whereas, and someone from Africa probably doesn't struggle with that at all. They don't have any problem believing in the resurrection. And one of the interesting things I just saw, I was looking at some surveys of the Bible, of people's attitudes for the Bible. I think Ligonier did a survey with Lifeway, which was asking Americans about their ideas about the Bible. And it was interesting because just in the last 5 years, the number of Americans that believe the Bible is the Word of God is up. And the number of Americans that really want to camp on this word literal is down. And the number of Americans that believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ is up. So people are going to have a jumble of ideas on these topics. But I do think Christianity, philosophically, I think this is what it really only works with the resurrection of Jesus being the fulcrum. It's the final, it's the unmovable place in the universe. And I think that's what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, that we can have a lot of debates about how does the book of Genesis speak. But when it comes to the resurrection of Christ, he was not only, and Colossians says this, Colossians 1, he is the icon of the invisible God. He is the author of creation 1.0, and he is the first fruits of creation 2.0, the new creation. And so in the body of Jesus, we see he is the beginning of the new age, of the age to come. And so, okay, now where are Christians? And this is what the Apostle Paul writes about again and again in his letters. He says, be clothed in the Spirit. Well, why in the Spirit? Well, the Spirit is the beginning. The Spirit is God's gift to us that begins to transform us into the age to come. But right there, you're gonna begin to sense your utopian temptations. And Christians have done this. Christians have said, okay, well, I have the Spirit of God, therefore, well, be careful with that.
That's how we fall for it. That's how it poisons us.
That's right.
We think we are sons and daughters who have dominion.
That's right. That and so another group of cousins from in the Reformed family are the Dominionists.
Oh.
And the Reconstructionists, Rushduni
Right.
and that tribe. And so, there is a triumphalism in there that I don't think is proper for our mixed age context. If you want to read a fascinating book about utopianism, let me pull it up. It is, I read this a couple of years ago, and it was one of the most fascinating. It was on the Oneida community in upstate New York. And
by the way, my movie is about a cult, and I have a fascination with cults.
Oh, well,
that's why utopianism is my theme, because I keep making things about cults.
Well, I mean, if someone wanted to do, I'm just going to share. I'm going to share this screen a second. If someone wanted to do a film, that would probably, well, it's, I don't know. You'd have to be careful making this into a Christian film, but people would be very fascinated by it.
Is it a little bit like Wild Wild Country, would you say?
Yeah. Which was an amazing.
I know.
So this is the book, Oneida, From Free Love Utopia to a Well-Set Table.
By the way, I've already heard you talk about this. I've screenshotted that book before. I follow you closely.
Yeah, read that book, because she nails it. She's a descendant of this, but it so embodies the end of the 19th century, where they're Christians, kind of.
Right.
They're positivists, kind of. So they're practicing eugenics. They're practicing economics. They've got male-female equality. They've got, I mean, this is, in a sense, this is a predecessor to Brave New World. Before Huxley wrote Brave New World, these people were trying it.
Wow.
And so there are so many lessons you learn in that experiment. And it is just a fascinating book. And this is in this part of upstate New York in the United States that was called the Burned Over District, the same district that created the Jehovah's Witnesses, that the Mormon, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Millerites, who became the Seventh-day Adventists. And so this was the most Christian place in North America, because the two Great Awakenings just converted everyone. And in there, utopianism flourished, because this Christian triumphalism says, we got it licked. We have finally, we can create the kingdom of God on earth. And just like Wild Wild Country, they tried to bring down heaven, and they sure brought up hell, and it falls apart.
When do you think a cult starts to take shape? When is it a cult? When it's us and them, when it's like isolationism, would you say?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with intensity and size. I think our homo mensura, man is the measure culture we have is cultic, but it's just so large, and we've managed to adapt it well enough that it's not terribly tyrannical.
We're in a global cult.
No, that's right. I think the element of tyranny, and again, I think Peterson just nails this very well. And when I was watching, I think it was Maps of Meaning, when he talked about the fact that, he gets this from Solzhenitsyn, that large tyrannies can only develop when people self-tyrannize. And this is what I see happening with progressive liberationism, that all this owning of privilege, this is self-tyrannizing. Now, and when I began to see this as a Calvinist, I thought, I recognize this. This is the dance that Calvinists play with total depravity. We say, I can do no good. So suddenly I start to feel good about feeling bad about myself. And the worse I feel about myself, the more pride I have in feeling bad about myself. And you just start going round and round. And so when I see this happening in the privilege conversations, I think, Oh, we Calvinists have been doing that for years.
Wow, that's pretty dark, man.
It is dark. But it's the tyrannical aspect. See, and this again is, so I wrote a blog piece on hell a number of years ago, where there's this funny aspect where heaven and hell are deeply intertwined, because when Americans think about heaven, they think about Santa Barbara. And when they think about hell, they think about Newark, New Jersey. Okay, so I'm from Patterson. Patterson is about as dark as Newark, so I'm not, that these are my people. But that's how Americans think. But when they think that, they think of it in secular terms, that God is absent. Well, you read Dante, you read, you read the book of Revelation, God is all in all. Well, if you don't like God, you won't like living with him. So heaven would be hell for you. And you see this in marriages. People stand up and they've fallen in love with this person, and they promise before God and the world that they'll love this person until the day they die. And at our meetup last night, we were talking about the three times that divorce rates are highest are year 1, year 7, and year 25. And this is what we do.
With regards to, in a sense, descending into hell, as we just spoke of, can you compare the tree of the knowledge of good and evil with this utopianism thing? Is there a similarity?
I think the barring, so Adam and Eve rebel. They'd eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I think Peterson works a tremendous insight when he talks about that and their awakening. That the man and the woman are changed by this. And the fruit is not false, but they are no longer innocent. And then they are barred from the tree of life. And so in many ways, utopianism is an attempt to get past the angel with the flaming sword, to get back to the tree of life, and to say,
to get back in.
That's right. And God says, and the Tower of Babel, we're going to construct this.
Yes, exactly.
And so the confusion of the language is in fact it's both punishment and judgment and mercy. Because as they construct that hierarchy, it's going to get more and more tyrannical. And so God disturbs the order of their monolinguistic temple, their tower building culture, with the chaos of multiple languages.
And in the New Testament, besides, seek first the kingdom of God, what else is there that's like kind of a warning against utopianism, would you say? Do you see it in there? Or?
I don't know that the first century, I mean, they were so powerless. I mean, they were,
oh, wow.
The amazing thing is when you read the book of Revelation, chapters 2 and 3 are the 7 letters to the 7 churches. What's amazing is that let's date the book of Revelation at the end of the first century, that John could write to the churches and say, you will inherit the earth, because at that point they were having terrible conflict with the Jewish population in the synagogues that they split out with, and they were having increasing conflict with the imperial and pagan populations. The idea that in a couple,
they were bottom of the barrel almost.
They were completely at the bottom of the barrel, and so the thinking that is there insufficient admonition in the New Testament to pull us back from triumphalism? I don't know. I haven't given that much thought, but I doubt many in the first 3 centuries of Christianity had the context which would have tempted them towards it.
I just think when we read it now, with all our comforts and our pleasures, it might pursue us into like the prosperity gospel or whatever, because, you know, we're going to be fine because Jesus will bless you. And, you know, I think we misread the New Testament or something.
Well, C.S. Lewis, you know, famously and controversially said, pain is a megaphone, is God's megaphone to a deaf world. So
Yes.
even the temptation to utopianism is finally an expression of our rebellion,
Yes.
not an expression of faith. Because trust finally says, and you know, people, oh, what's my definition of Christianity? A Christian is someone who trusts Jesus more than they trust themselves. If you're a utopianist, you violate that trust because you have displaced Jesus. You no longer need him.
And that sounds so extreme. But although utopianism does permeate our personal lives, it comes into our families. You know, it's something that is closer to home than we think. Wouldn't you say?
That's right. Well, even in Peterson's "Clean Your Room." Now, for most of us, that's good admonition. Talk to an obsessive compulsive and tell them to clean their room. Oh, you don't want to do that. They are working that edge where they are utopianist by mental illness, and they will
Yes.
suffer no dirt, and they will suffer no person who violates the sanctity of their bedroom.
Because my cleanliness will deliver me.
That's right. That's right.
Right.
And that's where you'll see the purity cultures or the purity aspect just take off. And it's, with progressive liberationism, this is why they eventually eat their own. No one can be pure enough. And the intersectionality aspect of it just makes it all worse, because at least if it's male, female, well, you've only got two variables to watch. But now you've got race and male, female. Well, okay, so in that quadrant, then the black woman. All right, now let's intersectionality says, okay, there are no hierarchies. We're going to adjudicate all of it at once. Can't do it because of time and because of consciousness and because of human limitation. You cannot do it. And that's Peterson's point to Sam Harris about the a priori structure.
Yes.
Human beings cannot do this. And for that reason, we will never be able to create utopias. And every time we do it, we will create tyrannies, and those that are lower on the hierarchy will suffer. It can't go any other way.
And this is where the extreme left is going now, right?
That's right.
And it's very scary.
That's right. And so in that sense, the left-right thing doesn't really help us. You might just create a new spectrum, which is order chaos.
Yes. Yeah, we either go totalitarian, you know, or the other side.
And so on one hand you have then you have the totalitarians, or you have the libertines. Libertines say, let anybody do whatever they want. Well, there are families that are practicing that, and I know some of them. They become extreme libertarians, and well, here's the difficulty. You can never have community, because for two people to agree in choice, they have to set up a hierarchy. And even two individuals, usually in the confinement of let's say a marriage, even two individuals can't do that. And so the only way for two people to have it work is that there has to be submission. But once you practice submission, you violate the central tenet, that which is on top of the libertarian hierarchy, which is my assertive choice. And you might say, okay, well, submission is freely chosen. Okay, but so we can't, this is why we can't do this.
And then with regards to, you know, we're both Christians here, but we want to talk to a secular materialist world, right? Can we lead them to talk about original sin by maybe starting with utopianism? And, and like, guys, listen, this is impossible to reach. We all agree because of this. You call it human fallibility or whatever, but what is this thing that is stopping us from getting there? Should we not talk about that? Yeah. Because something is wrong, guys. We're not getting there.
I think, and your particular medium of film is very well suited to address this. Because again, back to the Oneida community, let's say, imagine a world where there's free sex. You can have sex with, there's free sex, there's free love, there's male-female equality, there's the full embrace of science and technology.
Yes.
There's sharing of material. There's nobody kept their own money. There's sharing of possessions. Some people might hear that and say, boy, that sounds like Acts 2. Well, not the sex part, but sharing of possessions, that kind of sounds like Acts 2. So, so the Oneida book would be, the left would say, that's exactly what we're talking about, and say, I have good news for you. It's been tried. I have bad news for you. It became capitalism. And that's the story, that it starts with this free love utopia, and it winds up being a for-profit capitalist corporation. Well, why? Well, what are the relationships? And so in film, I would call Ellen Whalen Smith and say, I want to license your book for a film. And, because it's all there. We keep trying it. Or, the Bhagwan back in Oregon, or, on and on and on, or the Soviet Union, or Nazi Germany, or even, the thing that I think the advantage that, let's say, the United States has had in terms of its founding fathers was that there was a pessimism. So the United States was a birth between religious exiles in New England and economic opportunists in Maryland, Virginia, Jamestown and Plymouth. And so what happens in the American Constitution is that both of these things get wed. And so that Calvinist pessimism, that helps the founding fathers say, we're gonna try and limit our utopianism, because you know what? New England really tried that. And
so would you say, you mentioned Calvinism now, but would you say Christianity is a more realistic route?
Oh, yes.
It's just more realistic, right?
Well, if you're a Christian, you have to say that, because you say it's true. Christianity better reflects the truth of the universe. And Christians say that truth is revealed in Jesus Christ, and in his incarnation, his ministry, his death and resurrection and ascension. So the story of Jesus is the story that sheds light on the rest of existence. That's essentially what Christians say. But if you're not a Christian, well, then what are you? It's many will fall for. Well, here's the problem. Okay, so you only live once. So I'm 55 years old. I've certainly had things in my life I enjoy. There's certainly things in my life that I'd like changed. I've got, realistically speaking, my father died at 77. My clock is ticking, baby. I got 27 years, maybe. All right. Let's say medical science improves. I die at 80. Okay. I got, I'm running out of time. Well, what do I need to do to have my best life now? What is it? Now suddenly the hierarchy kicks in again. What's at the top of my hierarchy? Helping my kids, sex, money, power, fame. It's all the usual suspects. And, and it's Augustine. These are all goods. It's Tim Keller. Tim Keller gets it from Augustine. They're all goods, but how do I order my loves? And
but we can't,
Christianity
We can,
says at the top, you submit to Christ.
yeah. So we can say the fact that we can't reach the top means there's something wrong with us. But what is it then?
Well,
Are we the only religion who really recognizes something is wrong?
no. Well, I don't know Islam
Or,
well enough, and
yeah.
part of
I mean,
any
deeply fundamentally wrong. You know, like fundamentally, there's a glitch in the matrix.
well,
There's something broken. There's something broken in us, and are we the only ones saying that?
I don't know,
Oh,
but we do. Christianity says, on one hand, we are limited. Even in creation, we are limited. But also, as C.S. Lewis says, we're not just limited, we're rebels who need to lay down their arms. That the path to redemption involves submission. Now, Islam, to the limited degree that I know it, has a theology of submission.
okay.
But, Christians finally, what I think, what we've seen is that a number of contemporary expressions of Islam have gotten very totalitarian. Christianity at this point, you have little sects and cults that can get a little totalitarian, but some of what it seems so the Protestant Reformation, obviously a very important deal in terms of the life of Christianity. Part of what the Protestant Reformation did was break open some of the order of the Western Church and introduce some chaos and some complexity and some diversity. And so Christianity, since that very bloody period following the Reformation, has often held back on the kind of grabbing for power that it dealt with in the Middle Ages.
I see. Okay.
So we've learned, I think Christians have learned some lessons.
Right.
And very much about this utopianism.
But then again, getting the shadow self. So Jung talks about it a lot. This dark side of ourselves. Is he talking about the sinful nature there?
Well, to the degree that I understand Jung, the shadow is the backside of the persona. So the persona is that which we show the world. This is our lying self, as Peterson would have, and especially lying pastors. It's the persona that we show the world, and it's at heart manipulative and selfish. The shadow is that which we are concealing.
Okay.
So, and that's why the shadow has to be integrated, because if you keep it this way, they keep fighting. And the goal then in Jung is to integrate it. And you'll hear Peterson say that all the time.
So that's not the sinful nature then. That's something else.
No. Christianity says that we inherit from our parents, that's original sin. We inherit from our parents the Heidelberg Catechism says we have a natural tendency to hate God and our neighbor. Well, why would we have a natural tendency to hate God and our neighbor? Well, because they are standing in the way of our own private utopias. That's one reason. So we're going to hate God because he defies us. And we're going to hate our neighbor for the same reason. They defy us. And so, look at why is it that if a married woman or a woman in a relationship with a man comes up murdered, that the boyfriend or the husband are the first suspects? Well, because statistics. Well, why? What's the deal with that intimacy and that violence? Well, in a marriage, you've greatly reduced the number of partners, and so you're looking for utopia. And certainly in the West, we have very utopian ideas about romantic relationships. Then you discover that your partner is your chief enemy to attain your utopia. So you're going to have the greatest hatred for that person.
Wow.
And so then you get into the Jung shadow conversation. Well, what do you do with that? What do you do with that conflict? Well, you'd better learn to integrate it as a couple.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay. So he didn't pinpoint something deeply wrong with us, really, Jung.
Jung? I don't know Jung
Yeah.
well enough to
Mm.
pass judgment on him in that.
Mm.
I think it's, many people say total depravity is the most empirically provable doctrine of Calvinism. But
Oh, really?
oh yeah,
Oh, they say that?
oh yeah.
Is Calvinism the most heavy on this? And is the other ones kind of like not really trying to avoid it, or what?
That's a hard question, because
Mm.
the label Calvinism and how it's assumed now is built on a lot of 17th century theology. If you
Okay.
read Calvin himself, he's, someone, let's say from the Orthodox Church, who would read Calvin would be very pleased to find Calvin's deep knowledge of the church fathers. What happens as
Wow.
the history in Europe continues to move culturally, Calvinism in the 17th century takes on a different edge that didn't have in the 16th century. So I wouldn't too starkly draw the contrast between Calvin and Luther and the Western Latin Church on these measures. They tend to nuance it in different ways because of the other elements in their theological economies. But
Okay.
Calvinism, as expressed, often gets this strong. Tulip, T, total depravity.
Yes.
I have a natural tendency to hate God and my neighbor. I don't know that Lutherans or Roman Catholics would disagree with that, but Calvinists tend to forefront it.
Mm-hmm. And then would you say the Universalists deny it? Or are they more not really into hell? Or
Universalists forefront the difficulties that hell brings to bear on the sovereignty of God. And part of the difficulty is that there are a lot of different kinds of universalists, and it's important to know which way they come at it.
mm-hmm.
My problem with universalism is that there are certain texts in the New Testament that are universalistic, and so we tend to read one in light of the other.
Okay.
But I don't know, the difficulty with universalism is what to do with some of the non-universalistic texts that are very stark and right on Jesus' lips.
Right.
Jesus talks about eternal perdition more than anyone else. Now, our understanding of the revelation that we have in the Bible is always limited. We get things wrong. So, my New Testament prof in seminary, when we were talking about eschatology, pre-mill, post-mill, amill, he said, especially with respect to this millennium that's in the book of Revelation, he said, if Jesus comes back and says, I'm going to establish a 1,000-year kingdom right here on earth, go along with him. So in a sense, recognize the limitations of our systems. And again, finally, the first foot we put forward is trust Jesus, that these things are not finally ours to accomplish, but God working through us often, surely, but God finally is the author of this grand consummation.
I think we covered most of it, hey?
Oh, good. Good.
I'm really grateful. Thank you so much. I really apply, whenever I make my films, I always have to, really develop my thinking behind it and why am I doing this? And my characters are always essentially destroyed by their own utopian views. My films are mostly tragedies,
Yeah.
And at the end of these films, they are normally quite ruined. And when they are ruined, this is when the enlightenment moment comes on, when the light bulb comes on.
That's right.
That's right. So what I'm grappling with is when I end my films and I show the light bulb, do I put a signpost of, okay, if this is not it, then this is.
Yeah.
and I tend not to. I tend to keep it open-ended. But I think at least I know I'm pointing in the right direction.
Yeah.
Because as a filmmaker who's a Christian, I have a duty in a sense to tell stories that I believe is truthful, and stories that reflect the way I see the world. But I don't want to. I never want to inject my agenda into a film. But I always have something to say. So I think the reason why this is important for me is I'm figuring out how to say it.
Well,
how to say it best.
I don't think not putting a big obvious sign and flag at the end is, I don't think the best reason to not do that is to not put your agenda. I think the better reason to not do that actually is within your critique of utopianism.
Yes.
Because.
But is that enough though? Because does it not leave people hanging? Because some people would just go, okay, then I'll be a nihilist.
Yeah. Well, let them try that. Let them try that for a while, and they'll find Jordan Peterson, and then they're going to start to look for better answers. Because the problem with a lot of Christian film is exactly the problem of utopianism. Because we Christians are still human beings, and either we kind of put a Jesus at the top and we can't flesh it out, so then it becomes a little tribal marker, or we do exactly what the utopians do and say, well, here it is, and we can't do it. The kingdom is finally a gift. It's not something we make. We are sub-creators. We are gardeners. We don't create the apple. We perfect it. So I don't think your open-ended approach is a bad one. And I don't. Have you seen
any films that has this kind of undertone of this message that are not overtly Christian but communicate this that you felt was effective?
One of my favorite films is Steve Martin's Leap of Faith. Have you ever seen that?
No.
Steve Martin's Leap of Faith. Deborah Winger, Liam Neeson. It came out in the 80s or 90s. Steve Martin is a fraudulent faith healer.
All right, I see.
And a kid gets healed legitimately.
Right.
And this takes Steve Martin apart. And Steve Martin finally needs to leave. He finally needs to leave his profession. And it's at that moment, you can do a soundtrack with it. And there's there are moments in there. Of course, Robert De Niro, the South African, why can't I think of the name of that film? It's a great film. The indigenous people, Jeremy Irons.
Oh, The Mission.
The Mission.
Love it so much.
Yeah. So, but to take a look at Leap of Faith, because comics often are some of the most impressive viewers of depravity, because
absolutely
it's out of there that the comic genius springs.
I think I'm just extremely disillusioned by how Christians have been so mediocre in regards to film. Well, maybe art in general, and they really lack some grit, to go where it's a bit dark. And I don't know why they're so cowardly like that. I just find it. I have a bit of a rebellion against it, so I'm hopefully going to be part of that change.
It's our utopianism. We want to close the deal with people, and pastors want to do this too. We want to offer a product and say, "Oh, here's the product." Well, in that sense, we displace.
Buy this.
That's right. Be a member of my church, and that will fix everything. Subscribe, support me on Patreon. Your kingdom will come. No.
So Paul Schrader, the guy who wrote Taxi Driver. His little backstory.
Oh yeah.
He wrote this book, Transcendent Style in Cinema.
Oh, okay.
And he basically he did a whole thesis on how to make a film that is filled with, where the viewer has to engage into the film and experience the transcendent message in the film. And almost he spoke about techniques that you use to encourage that in the editing, in the camera work. So for example, when when a person would exit a door and close the door, the camera would possibly hang around for another 10 to 15 seconds even. So that you are experiencing this journey, you are leaning in, you know. So I think this simplistic, force-fed films where the stories lean into us, the commercial projects, is not where Christians should operate in. It doesn't work.
Yeah. I think you're right.
I don't know. So I'm a big Paul Schrader fan.
Oh.
But anyway.
Well, maybe we'll have to maybe you and I should get in a rabbit room and watch First Reformed together, and you can,
yes,
you can highlight it. So, but I've got to run. I've got to meet somebody. But
thank you so much.
I sure appreciate this, and I'll send you the recording of this, and I suspect others would find value in what we discussed. But it's up to you.
Cool. Okay. Thank you.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.